Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled The Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Project of Southeast New England. Learn about organizations and find new collaborations across SNEP watersheds, brought to you by the Rhode Island School of Design. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program, along with Avery Davis from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center and Pang Suti Sambat from the New England Environmental Finance Center, who will be facilitating the Q&A at the end of the webinar. For those of you who haven't heard of the SNEP Network, the SNEP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through the management of stormwater and restoration projects. The network focuses on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, snepnetwork.org, for more information. And before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. There will be a Q&A and opportunity to ask questions. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. Additionally, you'll be able to request a certificate of attendance for joining this webinar. Information on how to do so will be available in our follow-up email after the webinar. We have closed captions available for today's webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the link that I will put in the chat. And on that note, I'd like to hand things over to Bryce Dubois, who will kick us off for today's presentation.
All right, hi y'all, and thanks Leah for that introduction. So yes, my name is Bryce Dubois. I likely know many of you, and for those that I don't know, welcome. And yeah, look forward to presenting, and also look forward to any questions and any conversation that we can have through this platform. So today we're going to be introducing you to the results and some outputs from the Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Project of Southeast New England, also known as StewMAP SNE. And yeah, we're looking to share about organizations in the region and some findings related to collaboration, and also show you an interesting tool. So to start off, we thought we'd begin with just a bit of interactivity to find out who's joining us today. So we're going to use Mentimeter. Hopefully folks are familiar with this. So a couple of different ways to access Mentimeter are to hold up your phones if you have a phone with you, and use the phone camera to read the QR code that's on the screen. Or you can enter the URL that was just dropped into the chat, or a third way is to go to the top of the screen, enter www.menti.com, and use the code 33963124. So 3 different ways. And essentially, we just like for you to enter in your name, your organization, and what watershed or watersheds, if you're using smaller scale watersheds, do you work in. Great, so I see a few folks jumping in. Good to see y'all, welcome. All right, I'll give you a couple more minutes to enter if you desire to. Otherwise, our roll call will end. Great, well, welcome Megan, welcome Danica, Jen, Courtney, Corey, Abel, Liz, Veronica, Casey, Julie, Kathleen, and Devin, welcome y'all. Thanks for joining us. And for those that are going to watch this later, welcome, and hope you enjoy and learn something. This research team is comprised of a range of individuals from multiple institutions. So these include myself from the Rhode Island School of Design, Jesse Sales, who's an ORISE postdoctoral fellow, who's appointed within the US EPA Office of Research and Development, and the Atlantic Coastal Environmental Sciences Division. Ben Carlson of Compass Cartographic, formerly Brown University. Casey Merkel, recent graduate of the RISD Master's Program in Nature, Culture, and Sustainability Studies. Kurt Spalding of Spalding Environmental and Climate Strategies, and formerly Brown University, EPA, and Save the Bay. We've had previous assistants from research assistants, Shreya Kaifa, who's a rising senior at RISD, and Ben Myers, formerly at Brown University, and now formerly at Serped, and we're excited to say that he's joining a master's program at University of Pennsylvania. And we've had some great support, and we continue to have support from folks at the USDA Forest Service in the Northern Research Station, Michelle Johnson, Lindsay Campbell, and Erica Svensson, as well as John Zukoglu of Pratt Institute and Krista Heinlein of the Davy Institute, also with the USDA Forest Service in the Philadelphia Field Station. So just a sort of overall webinar agenda for today. Just after this slide, I'll hand this over to Kurt Spalding to introduce some of the framing of the work. We're going to describe a bit about StewMAP and why we did it and why it's an approach that we think is valuable. We'll describe some results from our efforts, including especially attribute data, spatial data, and network data. And then we're going to present a use case just to give you a sense of some of the questions that you might ask to the data or to the dashboard. We're going to focus in this case on the Blackstone River watershed. And then we'll conclude, again, share out opportunities to investigate these ideas with additional resources, and then also hopefully have a discussion. So with that, I'd like to pass the baton over to Kurt to share a bit about the framing of this project and stewardship more generally.
Well, thank you, Bryce, and hello, everyone. I think, Bryce, you're turning my slide, right? Is that the plan? So I have to tell you to do that?
That's right. Yeah, just tell me when you want me to answer it.
Just running out our technical situation here. So, well, first of all, thank you for all for joining us. And what I want to do is just share a little bit about where stewardship came from and where it is today, and give a context for this work, which we're very proud to have been doing. So, Bryce, go ahead and flip it. So, what I'd like to do is think about stewardship as three kinds of stewardship: stewardship historic, stewardship new, and stewardship today, and make some observations as I go through these descriptions. So go ahead and flip it, Bryce. So when we think about stewardship originally, or when we think about what I was doing originally, and remember, I was executive director of Save the Bay from 1990 to approximately 2008. So I had a nice long run during what I think is the developing formative period of environmental advocacy. What we did was we would organize, and we had this idea that essentially government would do what would carry the mission forward. We didn't even call it stewardship. If you could flip it, Bryce. So we went from government will do it to we will do it. And that's kind of the conversation I want to bring forward here. So stewardship historic was about, it's been around for a very long time, way back to the early 20th century, where land conservation stewardship became a big matter in this country. We all know about Roosevelt, Leopold. I really love Olmsted, who actually took the idea of parks and open space into the urban core of the industrializing Northeast especially, but built parks all the way from Boston to Buffalo, basically all over, even out west. So this is a kind of stewardship we all recognized, land stewardship, where land trusts and others would conserve land. But through the 20th century, we saw the fact that the social ecological system, and this is I like to think about what we do now as an integrated system, not ecology here, social there, but actually a system of connection where ecological services actually support the social well-being of people and communities. And what we saw through much of the 20th century, especially the last half of the 20th century, is something called managed adaptive decline. MAD, as my friends at the Resilience Futures Group like to call it. So out of that decline emerged a new movement, or a more intense movement in 1970, what we now thought of as the environmental movement. And out of that rose this idea of new stewardship. But as my slide points out, it's not what we called it. I never referred to myself in 1988 or 1987 or 90, or even through much of right up to the 2000 as a steward. We were generally referred to as advocates. But then things kind of changed as we saw as the movement matured, especially the water focused work. Place-based strategies emerged, the Chesapeake Bay program and others. So let's flip the slide. Again, this is the scale of the environmental movement in 1970. I think we forget just how big a movement it was and just what happened. Flip the slide, please. I always like to show this slide. I used to show it to students at Brown, just how much happened because of that movement. All these acts. And as regional administrator of EPA, believe it or not, I was responsible for a lot of these. It's a big scope, but it illustrates what this advocacy movement was really about, was getting government to take action to restore and protect our environment. Flip again. As stewardship emerged, people started to care about places more than laws and programs. So I was very involved in something called the Narragansett Bay Comprehensive Management Program. It still exists. Narragansett Bay Program is generally referred to. It came out of the Chesapeake Bay Program. Some of the things we recognize through this is that local connections are stronger connections, less about law and more about place. Then we learned that there are things we couldn't do or government couldn't do without this focus on place. So habitat restoration, environmental education, these were new agendas as emerged through the period. Keep going. So just to review what I experienced, and Bryce has urged me to be very personal about this. We were advocates. We did a lot of advocacy work, and a lot of it was about stopping the industrialization of our coastal resources, championing tremendous investment, well over $2 billion. This is just Narragansett Bay I'm talking about. We did a lot to connect land use thinking to water quality. If you recall back in the 80s, not so much. We were all thinking about the Federal Clean Water Act and the federal government's ability to affect land use or manage or regulate land use is quite limited under our federal system. Lots of policy outcomes, meaning lots of legislation, regulation, et cetera. But then we started to see in the mid-90s what turned us to a more stewardship-based vision, and that was about community-based restoration. Now, interestingly, the government was doing some of this. NOAA had a program. Connecticut actually had a very established program of government-based restoration, salt marsh restoration work. But the Pew Charitable Trust offered to fund groups like Save the Bay to come together and form Restore America's Estuaries. And they asked us this question, you're like, what would you all want to do? And we said, well, we want to move into this more like stewardship activity of actually physical restoration. And it connected to this civic engagement tradition that is very uniquely American. This idea of barn raising, where people would come together to do something for their community on a volunteer basis. And then the whole model kind of grew around environmental education. And I call that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation model because they were really the leaders in building place-based education work. You can flip it. How did we make it happen? Well, it saved the bay. We started redefining turf. We used to be just about the bay, and then we started working in Taunton, and we actually established bay and river keepers. The South Coast keeper in southern Rhode Island, South Coast Rhode Island, is actually founded by Save the Bay, still part of Save the Bay. Lots of network work, and you'll see this in what this StewMAP is all about. It's about understanding networks. I was part of two very important networks, something we call the Red Sox. I never quite understood why, but it was an environmental group network of leaders. Restore America's Estuaries, as you all know, has become a very important organization where estuarine coastal groups, larger ones, are connected. And then we did a lot of capacity sharing. With Pew's money, we actually funded smaller groups, and we started to share capability around GIS. These are themes you'll see in what's going to be proposed today. Flip it. But what came out of this, what we call stewardship new? Stewardship being historic, the old land conservation stewardship, stewardship new. This was much more complex as we built this vision through the 90s. We need to remember that just as we were building this, funding for environmental governance started to shrink. So the state funding started to get reduced. Eventually, it hit the federal side. When I first joined EPA as regional administrator, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of nearly 700 FTE. By the time I left, we were closer to 600. But most of all, we were really connecting the idea that the social ecological system, the system of people and ecology coming together, is what sustains quality of life in southern New England. And that by doing this kind of participation-based work or work that increases understanding, like education work, we were strengthening the understanding of how the system goes together. Next slide, please. Oh, are we ready for another cue there, Bryce?
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Kurt. That does come to the end of your slide deck, but do you want to say anything more in closing?
Well, I think the thing that, what this does, the stewardship new, as I'm referring to it, what we built through basically through the 90s and through the 2000 on, remembering how much growth there's been in this, the strength of habitat restoration work, the strength of environmental education work, the broader definition of stewardship from where it was as a land conservation idea to now a holistic social ecological system idea. All of this is what we need to now understand if we're to understand how conservation and protection and well, just the whole mission of the work for both government and non-government actors carries forward. And that's why I think the idea of mapping and understanding stewardship, what it is and how it's changing is essential to understanding how our coastal resources are going to be stewarded through the dynamic period that's ahead with climate change. So I'll close with that and turn it over to you, Bryce.
That's great. Thanks, Kurt, especially for framing the role of stewardship in the Southeast New England region. And I think, based on your framing, the importance of a diversity of stewardship activities and approaches is at least one particularly important feature of this environmental governance approach that I can sort of hear you talking about.
Yes.
And so, yeah, so I guess, we just wanted to also then now open it up to give folks in attendance a chance to express what stewardship means to you. And so again, turning to that same Mentimeter, and I see that a few folks have already have already done so, you can use, again, this QR code or the URL that you use to enter your name. If you would enter one word or phrase that for what stewardship means to you. I think you can enter up to 3 times. So if you're really gung-ho, feel free to put a number of them up. Great, I see responsibility, accountability, connection, collaboration, protection and management, advocacy, action, collaboration, responsibility, connection, and protection appear to be some of the primary ways that folks think about stewardship here. Community building. Give another minute or so if you've got some other words or phrases that come to mind that you want to add here. Or perhaps you hit your 3 and you're all out. Overseeing, okay. Take that as a type of management. Sustaining. Caretaking. Great. Well, thanks very much for participating in that. And it'll be interesting to track how your ideas about stewardship align or are somewhat different from those that we heard from our respondents in the in this research project. So I'll switch over now to presenting a little bit more about the project and more about framing, this particular approach. For this project, we utilized the StewMAP methodology to develop a survey and public database to map the range of stewardship activities and networks with interest in strengthening community capacity for stewardship in this region. From this approach, we have the opportunity to learn about groups who take care of this region, where there are gaps and or concentrations of care, and where groups are working, the issues they're working on, and who's working in a community or on a specific topic, among other kinds of opportunities and ones that maybe we haven't even thought of yet as a research group that, again, we're sort of hopeful that folks here will take some of these ideas and want to work, and some of this data and want to work with it. This research approach and methodology is part of a community of practice led by the USDA, US Forest Service, especially the individuals that we mentioned in those introductory slides. On this particular slide, this shows places where there's specific StewMAP methodology, which is a part of a broader approach for doing organizational network analysis, but it's where this particular methodology has been either started or completed. And as you can see, this is a global community of practice with a fairly large East Coast contingency, and we're amongst them. This SNEP region, in our sort of SNEP regional StewMAP effort, we're unique because we're working on a relatively large geographic boundary. We're working beyond urban boundaries, where in many other cases of StewMAPs, they're particularly focused on city scale. We've taken a watershed focus, and you'll see that in a number of the different products and efforts that we've been working on. And in particular, of course, as Leah mentioned at the beginning, we're embedded within the SNEP network, and so aim to make this useful to those ends as a sort of collaborative effort to support stormwater and green infrastructure projects. In this particular methodology, we define stewardship organizations as civic organizations with 2 or more people who focus on at least one of the following 12 functions of stewardship. So those include conservation, managing, monitoring, transforming, caring for specific living things, building partnerships, engaging in place-based traditional gathering of resources for consumption, restoring native habitat, preparing for environmental disturbances, funding or providing in-kind material support, educating on and or advocating for the environment, and in all sort of across a defined city, region, or landscape. And of course, in this particular case, looking at the SNEP region. As we mentioned previously, this methodology and analysis draws on 3 types of information. So we gathered attribute data, including data about organizations' work and their organizational capacity, such as budgets and staff. And we sought to create an accurate representation of where they engage in stewardship, AKA their stewardship turf that we'll talk about in more detail later on. And we sought to learn about how organizations are connected, especially their knowledge and funding source networks. So we conducted this work in 3 phases. Beginning in October 2019, we sought to create an inventory of organizations and to develop the survey and approach. And in phase 2, from November 2020 to June 2021, we surveyed the network and their alters, and we'll talk a bit more about what alter means, but it's essentially the individuals who are not in our original organizational inventory, but who were named as part of those networks. And then lastly, we've been working on for this last year, cleaning, data analysis, and this as an example of data dissemination. So in this sort of phase 1 period, we worked with the StewMAP OMB cleared survey format, which we adapted from that StewMAP methodology for our region. To do this, we sought feedback from 12 individuals or members of environmental organizations in the region, and we sought their feedback to revise the survey to focus on relevant questions, phrasing about stewardship functions, and other attributes. Our particular sample included civic society-like group, and we'll talk a bit more about what we mean by the sort of civic society-like groups later on as well. But these are groups that were made up of 2 or more people whose work again focused on one of the 12 stewardship functions previously mentioned. And then we also included federally and non-federally recognized tribal nations in the region. From that inclusion criteria, we developed our initial database of 390 organizations. And again, that pulled from regional coalition websites, SNEP network outreach databases, lists of stormwater coalitions and green infrastructure collaboratives, and through organizational lists shared by that similar group of key informants. Survey participants were recruited through snowball sampling methods, wherein the initial set of organizations, that 390, were contacted. So our 3 research assistants split up and worked on one of the 3 sort of general basins. You can sort of see that generally color coded, though they're not really hard distinctions. So of course you can see the green overlaps into the Narragansett Bay watershed, for example. But those 3 RAs contacted groups from that inventory, initially by email if they had those listed, and for groups with no email but phone numbers, called at least 1 time. So initial contacts were used to confirm contact information, to discuss the StewMAP project, and to clarify questions about the survey and the effort. They followed up with 3 reminder emails on 1 to 2 week intervals, and made additional contacts once the survey was sent. So following the initial data collection phase, we engaged in 3 rounds of those alter surveys. So seeking contact information for folks that were named by those initial participants, but who were not in our inventory. And through that snowball sample, we developed a final sample of 718 groups. So a couple of notes here. There's some subjectivity in this final sample, as we made case-by-case decisions regarding organizations in order to retain, again, the idea of a civic society-like groups. So for example, we retained some groups that identified as city or even federal orgs, but we retained them if they had, for example, a .org website and functioned as best as we could identify as a local organization. We also sought to focus on the units most relevant to the organization, so meaning some organizations asked to have subgroups of their organization participate because they were sufficiently distinct from the larger group. And just a note here, in some of our analyses that we'll describe, we report aggregations up to this idea of the parent group of the organization. So there are times when we retain those really small scale. There are other times when it's more appropriate to sort of level up and make and present aggregations of that sample. And so in total, our final sample with complete data includes 149 groups, and there are 143 groups that agreed to be on the public dashboard and that agreed to be named in that way. So finally, in terms of the phasing, and we're sort of within that phasing here, this third phase, we engage in a range of data cleaning activities to prepare for analysis, as well as to provide a clean data set for public dissemination. So this includes the attribute data file, and that goes along with it a data dictionary that sort of decodes those attribute names. This also includes spatial data, where we worked with organizations to represent their turfs as accurately as possible. And when possible, we replace turf polygons with authoritative sources. So the image on the right shows an example of refining two responses to align with an authoritative source that was described in a similar way by those respondents. So it's just an example of doing that with all 149 respondents for the survey. Finally, edge lists are available for public download for the knowledge funding and other important collaborator networks. And again, in this presentation, we report and visualize the aggregated versions of these, but do have the disaggregated versions of that data available upon request. And all of that data download will be available on the SNEP network website as a downloadable zip file. All right, so before moving on, we thought we would just pause and provide an opportunity for Q&A. So does anyone have any questions for me, the team, Kurt, anyone thus far?
And if you do have any questions, feel free to drop it in the question section of the menu. So Bryce, it looks like you did an excellent job of explaining, because we are not seeing any questions right now. So you can go ahead and move on to that second portion of the webinar.
Cool, sounds great. All right, so here's where we'll dive into the meat of the analysis and some of the potentially more interesting aspects of the work, though that's not to not highlight Kurt's really important contribution for framing this work and the history and context to this work. So first, presenting the sort of some of this attribute data. So essentially what I'm going to do here is just describe some of the overarching responses to what these groups identify as, and you may identify as one of these groups, those that are sitting in the space now. So when asked to identify primary stewardship activities, organizations mentioned most commonly that they were attempting to conserve or preserve the local environment. So that included, for example, to perpetuate cultural values and practices related to stewardship, hold conservation easements, protect water resources, open space protection, etc. The second most common was to educate the public about the local environment, and the third to advocate and or plan for the local environment. But when given the opportunity to name all stewardship activities that they engage in, those that were moderately correlated with others included caring for specific living things and conservation activities, managing, monitoring, or restoring the natural environment. Conservation was also moderately correlated with monitoring and restoration. And finally, restoration was moderately correlated with monitoring as well. And so what we are attempting to do there is to sort of highlight that there are sort of reasonable groupings of stewardship types by identifying these moderately correlated stewardship activities. So we also asked groups about the sites that they work in, the systems that they're attempting to engage, and the green infrastructure activities that they engage in. And so when allowed to select many, or when they engaged and when they responded to the multiple choice, the top 3 site types that you can see on the upper left-hand side of the screen were we're working on conservation land, greenways, and parks. The top 3 system types were wetlands, forests, and coastal shorelines, followed closely by watersheds and streams. And green infrastructure intervention types were conservative conservation protection, restoration of natural features, or none at all, which is sort of interesting. But when push came to shove and they were required to name one, the top 3 were conservation lands, working in watersheds, or actually none at all, right? So again, sort of tracing the reality that some groups are really identifying with specific site types, but there is a subset of groups that are not identifying at all with a particular site type. So they're retaining a sort of broader idea of stewardship beyond site type alone. When asked to describe their missions, the most common word or phrases were community and conservation at 56 and 48 mentions respectively. This is again out of the 149 respondents. Rounding out the top 10 most common words or phrases are Rhode Island, which is sort of in many ways a holdover from the sort of overemphasis on Rhode Island groups that happen to be respondents in the sample. We also had the fourth most common was watershed, people, benefits, natural resources, open space, water quality, and rounding out that top 10, advocacy. I'll let you all just take a look at this before I move on. And you can see here some folks were more specific, while other key words or phrases were more broader. Okay, and then when asked to describe their group's primary organizational focus, which wasn't necessarily, this question is not asking specifically about stewardship, but out of their overall organizational focus, what do they sort of name as their primary focus? The most common was environment, likely not surprising because that is the type of organizations that we initially were seeking responses from. Followed by much smaller sets of groups focused on education, community improvement, food, and climate change. And I'll let you take a look at this for a moment longer. And so a key aspect of this work of the data set and of potentially future questions that we might ask to the data is organizational capacity. And so we think of organizational capacity a number of ways, and these are some key features, key attributes that we're thinking about with capacity, though there are other ways to sort of think about parsing this data. But organizations were on average 36 years old with a median of 32. The oldest, 181 years old, with the youngest less than a year old. And while there are a number of large groups in the region, the median staff info is telling, with 0 full-time, 1 part-time, 100 members and 40 volunteers. So you can see that that the sort of median level of groups is actually working with a very small group of people. Budgets also range from over $40 million to 51 groups reporting no budget at all. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see different types of funding that were reported. This is a binary analysis. So we took percentages that groups named, and we converted that into whether or not they had this funding type, just again, yes or no. And so this doesn't necessarily represent the weighting, right? Does a group have 50% of their funding from one source or another? So this just reports, yes, did they receive this kind of funding, or no, did they not? And so the most common funding source across all organizations is individual donations, with fees, fundraisers, and foundation support rounding out the top 3. Another set of questions that we asked groups was what organizations do they provide, and what services are they providing, and what services are they seeking? So in an ideal world, these graphs would match, and if both were mirror images, conversely, it means we'd have a bit of a problem in terms of supply and need. So if these matched right on, then we would say, okay, we're actually in a good space. So we found that educational trainings, research, and labor are the top 3 services provided, with grants, labor, and research as the top services groups are seeking. So the number 1 issue of grants is troubling because we have folks, not many groups providing grants and many groups seeking grants. But in terms of the other services, those do align somewhat. And so again, in that top 3, we can see that that research and labor are actually both provided and also something that folks are seeking. So one thing that we're interested is that in next steps, doing further analyses that link seekers to providers where there's interest. So again, this is a bit of an appeal to folks where to sort of find out where those sort of questions are of interest to people. So 2 important caveats are that we did not survey federal, state, and similar entities. And so this set of services provided and seeking would look very different with their inclusion. And later in the presentation, we'll report a larger funding network. Okay, so moving on to spatial turf data. We applied a negative ½ kilometer buffer in the search area to parse the turf responses by basins. And here we show 4 categories within the 3 major watersheds and the multi-watersheds. So this analysis shows an overwhelming number of groups in our sample work in either the Narragansett Bay watershed or between the Narragansett Bay and Buzzards Bay watersheds. For those unfamiliar, we report the turf area in hectares. And so if you're a Pats fan, you can see on the left that a football field is equal to 2.47 hectares. So we have groups, as we can see in our analysis, working at a range of scales from small groups working on school gardens, that sort of 0.05 or 0.02 hectares, to groups working on the entire eastern seaboard that max all 3 measure 37 million hectares plus is an example of that. From this focus on watersheds, we developed a dashboard led by Lynn Carlson to provide a public resource to investigate group attributes and their turfs and networks by watershed. And so I'm just going to play a short video that Lynn created to introduce you all to this dashboard.
Welcome to the Southeast New England Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Dashboard. We have compiled this dashboard to enable end users to view the data we have collected on environmental groups working within the Southeast New England program region. These data include their turf, which consists of the geographic area each organization has identified as being where they work, as well as specific details about their organization, such as their primary stewardship activity, focus areas, site and system types, and other information. Upon opening the dashboard, the end user is presented with a map of the Southeast New England region, with all their turfs for all organizations illustrated with a green outline. On the upper left, a list of estuary basins and subwatersheds is presented. Below that is an element which provides a count of organizations. This element is dynamic, meaning that it will change as the end user interacts with the list above. There are a total of 143 organizations in the database used in this dashboard. Below the counter is a list of organizations in the database by name. This list is also dynamic. Upon choosing an estuary basin or subwatershed, the list will be updated to include only those organizations whose turfs overlap that estuary basin or subwatershed. On the right side of the dashboard, there are a series of charts which display the number of organizations which identified in the affirmative as participating in a particular activity or focus area. For example, in the primary stewardship activities chart, 103 organizations identified having advocate as their primary stewardship activity. The end user can view other charts using the arrows at the bottom to tab through them. These charts are also dynamic. Counts will change when an estuary basin or subwatershed is selected from the list at the top left. To interact with the dashboard, one can begin by clicking an estuary basin or subwatershed. In this demonstration, I will select the Buzzards Bay Estuary Basin. You will see the map zoom to and flash this geographic area with a purple outline. The counter element will update to inform you that 66 organizations in the database overlap this estuary basin. The names of those 66 organizations are shown on the list on the bottom left. The charts on the right are updated with their distribution across the various activities and focus areas. For example, of the 66 organizations in the Buzzards Bay Estuary Basin, 43 of them identified as having advocate as one of their primary stewardship activities. 25 of them identified as having care as one of their primary stewardship activities, etc. To regain the full complement of organizations in the database, simply click the estuary, basin, or subwatershed to clear it. To find out information about a specific organization, select it from the list on the lower left of the dashboard. The map will zoom to and flash this organization's turf in the map, as well as display the organization's details in a pop-up window. You can close the pop-up by clicking the X in the upper right corner. It is also possible to click anywhere on the map itself to generate a pop-up which shows all the organizations whose turf overlap the location clicked. Note that due to the complexity of the data, the map will take a moment to respond. The details of each organization can be displayed using the arrows in the upper right corner of the pop-up. In addition to the map, the end user will find tabs along the bottom of the dashboard which can be used to display the following elements: a project background and information description, and each of the 5 network diagrams which have been compiled to illustrate network connections. The aggregated combined network, aggregated funding network, aggregated other key collaborator network, and aggregated knowledge source network. Below each of these diagrams are explanations on how to interpret them, along with additional metrics. We hope you find this dashboard informative and a useful way to explore the numerous environmental groups working within the Southeast New England program region.
So thanks again to Lynn for providing that introduction to the dashboard, and we'll have time for a Q&A just at in the next probably 20 minutes or so. So please prepare your questions if you have them about the dashboard. Feel free to enter them into the chat now if they're really pressing. But I'm going to continue on and pass the baton over to Jesse Sales to talk about the network data and analyses. And then we'll present just again a use case before closing.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. I hope everyone hears me. I believe I'm unmuted. So you saw a little bit of an introduction to the network data in that dashboard video right there. I'm going to talk to you a bit more about the network data. And I will point out actually that the networks that are in the dashboard are interactive and dynamic. You can select individual organizations through a drop-down, through the network diagram itself, and see who they're connected to. And you'll actually see some animations at the end of this talk when Bryce goes to the use case illustrating that. Anyway, Bryce, why don't you pull up the next slide? So these are the 3 primary networks that we collected information about. You see the images here on the screen, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what all these numbers mean, because it can be quite overwhelming to just look at a giant image like this, and so we can actually use some statistics, some descriptive statistics, to help us make sense of that. So I'm going to explain all of that for you. But before I do that, I just want to pause a minute and talk about why we're looking at the aggregated data that Bryce mentioned at the very beginning. You know, as Bryce said, when we contacted organizations to participate, we worked with them to help understand like what made the most sense for their participation, because some groups work as, you know, have sub-programs operating within the region, and those sub-programs really kind of are almost like their own, their sub-programs, their own things. And so they wanted to participate as sub-programs. When you look at the data, at the dashboard, you'll see, for example, that Audubon Society, both in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, is just one example where they had individual programs in Massachusetts and individual programs in Rhode Island that participated instead of just all of Mass Audubon and Audubon Society of Rhode Island. But when people start to say who their partners are, when we ask them these network questions, they don't always speak that way. And so you kind of have to aggregate things together to have a bit of an apples to apples comparison. Otherwise, it just gets a little bit misleading about how things are represented. If some people say we work with Mass Audubon and other people are saying we work with a specific sub-program, it's just, you know, people aren't getting their share of nominations when you start to put it that way. We do have the disaggregated data, and that is publicly available if you're interested in working with it, and you just contact us. But what we've made for download is the aggregated data because it's more straightforward to work with, and it's less prone to misinterpretation. So all of that aside, let's talk about these pictures that we have in front of us here. So we had, out of 149 people that responded to the survey, they reported a total organizational network of 740 organizations when we look at just those sub-programs, and then when we aggregate them up, that sort of reduces to 638. But that's a very large network of organizations that are directly in the SNEP region or connected to and supporting actors in the SNEP region. The knowledge source network with 466 organizations in it is clearly the largest one. 245 organizations were involved in the funding network, and we also asked people if there are other key collaborators, 214. The red circles are survey respondents. The blue circles are groups that did not respond. And you know, and some of these, again, like you can kind of look at them and start to see, okay, this person's connected to that person. And if we were actually in the interactive graphics on the dashboard, you could literally zoom in and click on it and see their names as he was connected. But just looking at these pictures, it can be a little bit difficult. And so I've calculated some statistics here. At the bottom, you can see, for example, that network density, which is just a measure of like how many relationships are in the network divided by the total number possible, is very low. And these networks are also very decentralized, meaning that there's not one or two or three organizations that are holding everyone together. All the organizations kind of just have a small number of relationships. And there's a number of implications here that this could mean, and some of it's contextual, but often sparse decentralized networks, it can be very difficult to get information from one side to the other, for example. And so maybe that's something that you have observed in the region. I don't know. These types of networks can actually be very good, however, for coming up with innovative solutions, because when everybody's connected to each other, you can kind of get the same ideas just repeating. So, you know, again, we can't know for sure because these what's going on, because it's somewhat contextual, but maybe by understanding these pictures of the networks, you can kind of think about, does this, you know, how is this resonating with the things that I've seen around, and does this support how I see the network functioning around me, or maybe this raises some new questions that I hadn't thought about. We looked at reciprocity, like if I say you're a key partner, do you say I'm also a key partner? If I share knowledge with you, do you share knowledge with me? The knowledge network had about 15% of those relationships reciprocal, and that tends to be an indication of stronger relationships. But again, this needs to be put in context. Funding, there was no reciprocity, but that's not surprising because people tend to receive money from funders and they don't tend to give it back. So Bryce, if you want to just go to the next slide. If you want to have a few names to some of these dots, at the bottom there, I've just listed the top 4 organizations in each network. So the numbers there, you know, RIDEM has 42 nominations as a source of knowledge, for example. So you can see RIDEM is very prevalent in many of these, University of Rhode Island, the Nature Conservancy, Mass Audubon. If you look at the funding network, you'll see that SNEP is in the top funding list. Again, so it starts to give you an idea of maybe who are some of the key players. And if you were to then again look at the interactive dashboard, you can also do the opposite and start to see maybe who are groups that are a little bit more marginal, and what might that imply? Is that a role that they are seeking to play? Is it perhaps indication that their voice is not being heard? So by looking at these pictures, you can start to generate a lot of questions about understanding what's going on in the network around you. Bryce, next slide. Sort of on that same token of understanding, what's going on around you and what that might mean, we also asked people if there were groups that they would like to work with but had not been unable to work with, and we also asked them why. This is not in the public-facing database because we did tell people that we would keep this information confidential and report it only in aggregate form, because we wanted people to feel that they could reply as they felt. And here I'm actually reporting on the disaggregated data, so we really have this sort of one-to-one relationship. People replied all kinds of things because this was open-ended. So at the bottom there, response types, 78 people said, 78 of the responses were to specific groups, like they actually named someone. 28 were more to like a general category. 10 people said none. And that's interesting data, right? That doesn't mean they dismiss the question. It just means that, they feel like they're working with everyone that they need to. And so you can see that in the diagram, I've indicated that. Some people said, hey, we just want to work with everybody. And then there were a few sort of other responses in there. So look, there's 4 groups on the diagram here. You can see SNEP. There are 4 groups that are specifically calling out that they like to work more with SNEP. On the right here are some graphs talking about the reasons why people wanted to reach out and work with other groups. And the bottom graph is, again, sort of illustrating the group types that they wanted to reach out and work with. So in the top graph, you can see that, a number of people were wanting to work with other people for specific projects or to gain knowledge or expertise, some funding requests. And you can see the numbers kind of trail off, but even though it's a small number, I highlighted this diversity one here, the sort of idea of people specifically saying they wanted to work with other groups to incorporate diverse voices, or because they thought that a group was somewhat underrepresented in the region, but a very important voice to be hearing. Some of that actually specifically translated over to groups that wanted to work more with some of the tribes in the region. And so I think that's very important for us to look at. At the bottom here, group type, you can see that many groups were seeking to look with nonprofits. There was, again, this sort of just people that were just calling generic groups, no specific name there. People were looking to work with universities, Fed, state, funders. Again, the specific call to wanting to reach out to tribes in the region. With a small then selection of local government and K-12 programs. So again, this is about sort of thinking about not what the network currently is, but what people's aspirations are and what they might be looking to actually reach out and work with. So next slide, Bryce. Another way we can look at this network data is a little bit more geographic. And so what this diagram here, it's called a chord graph, is showing you is basically organizations that are in one or that are overlapping one or more of those major watershed basins, Cape Cod and the Islands, Buzzards Bay, and Narragansett Bay. Are there connections to other groups also in that geography, or is it to another geography? And so these bars around the circle, I don't know if you see my mouse. I don't know how to make that work, but the bars around the circle are showing those geographies. So you can see the big blue one is Narragansett, the green one is Buzzards Bay, the red one's Cape Cod, and then the black and gray bars are the combinations, because many of these groups are regional and they span more than one. And so we can start to see like how that plays out. You can see that there's a lot of within collaborations within Narragansett Bay, and you can see that from one major estuary basin to the other, there are actually no relationships among groups that are just local to those basins. There are amongst the more regional groups. And so again, this is a way to start getting a picture of the collaboration patterns. And you might ask yourself, does it support or challenge the existing understanding that you had about partnership in the region? And do you think that maybe having more connections across a certain geography would advance certain goals? I highlight the fact that this is just a partial image. This is limited to only groups that completed the TERFs and also completed network data. So there's 120 organizations in this. Someone had to have a TERF and be named in the network, or name someone with a TERF in the network to be included in this. And we are working right now on an analysis that looks at the whole 700-ish groups in the entire network to do some geographic analysis. But they were limited to their addresses because not all those groups participated. We don't have TERF data. But just as an aside, an anecdote, I can tell you that the network spans quite far, and some things may or may not be surprising. There's certainly a lot of collaborations for knowledge sources or other things with groups up in Boston, such as the Charles River Watershed Association, but groups all the way up into Vermont, working the Champlain region. So it's not accurate to just think about a closed SNEP basin or SNEP region. This stewardship activity goes well beyond into the larger area. And you can see that all in the interactive diagrams on the dashboard. Okay, next one, Bryce. So this is an animation of something that we've been sort of poking away at. This is another way to maybe view the data. The current dashboard and protocol used by StewMAP, the one that you saw earlier, is great for many things, but it really doesn't allow a lot of interactivity between the network data and the spatial data. So here we're selecting organizations based on their TERF in the map. You just saw that, and it pulls up the network. So here it's selected the entire region, and now it's just showing you that this is interactive if you felt like moving that around. And at the bottom is attribute information about these organizations in the network, and we can click on one and actually see who their partners are and find out information about them. There's also some attribute at the bottom. And so this is, again, just changing as you change the geography. I'll make a note, this is something that we've been trying to do, that's in prep, that we've been working on. Right now it's using fake data with cat names. So if you were to zoom in, you'd see that. But if this is the type of thing that you find very interesting, we'd love to hear more about you, and we can kind of continue pushing the development of it if you thought this would be something you would really want to use, this higher level of interactivity between the geospatial information and the networks. Bryce, let's go to the next slide. Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse. And yeah, I mean, you're providing, I think you're providing a sense of both the analysis of the network and also aspirations. And I think that's one of our goals, obviously, is to sort of implore folks that are on this webinar that are going to watch it later to start to think about some of the goals that you have. So yeah, Jesse, I really appreciate that. Do you want to add anything else here, or should I jump into sort of describing this use case?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to be mindful of our time, let's continue pushing forward, and then we can discuss more things at the end.
Great. All right. So yeah, we just wanted to end the webinar by showing folks how you might use the dashboard. And it is primarily sort of engaging with the dashboard and those visual presentations that are on the dashboard. Some of this also is pulling from data layers that you might that attribute data, for example, that you could use to ask various questions or respond to various needs that you have. So the use case provided here is how someone might investigate collaboration in the Blackstone River watershed. And so specifically, we're just sort of asking these broadly framed questions of what groups work in Worcester, for example, the headwaters, or sort of generally the headwaters, what groups work in Rhode Island or / Pawtucket, or sort of the mouth or towards the end of the Blackstone. How do the funding source networks of Worcester groups differ? Specific groups differ from, for example, Rhode Island or Pawtucket groups. How do the knowledge networks of Worcester groups differ from Rhode Island / Pawtucket groups? Again, so looking at different ways that someone might sort of like different questions you might bring to bear to the dashboard and attribute data. Here's a view of the dashboard. After you select the Blackstone River watershed on the upper left-hand side of the screen, this would show you the 67 groups whose turfs intersect with the watershed. And so these are groups that are whose turfs, any of their turf touches at all the edge of the watershed. And then on the lower left-hand side, you'd see the number of groups, or you'd see the named groups, and you could select them to learn about organizational characteristics. And on the right, you would get a range of attribute data reported, the sum of that reporting. First looking at stewardship in the Blackstone, the most common activity is to educate, followed by to conserve or advocate about the local environment. Then if we were to look, for example, at the primary site types, which would be reported not in this style of a pie chart, but just as a list again, or as it would be shown as a bar chart on the right-hand side of your screen, excuse me. The most common site system or green infrastructure type that one would see is conservation of lands, followed by watersheds and forests. And then one would also see or could find out organizations' legal designation. So of course, given the focus on the sample of civic society-like groups, the most common group type, and this is true for the Blackstone River watershed, but also across our sample, is 501c3 groups, with a smaller range of other group types represented. You might also be interested in, for example, funding. And so here showing you that while 23 of the groups have no budget or report no budget at all, the remaining 44 get their funding from individual donations primarily, also followed by fees or local foundations. You can see a max budget of over $40 million, but median around 75K. Okay, so to see whose turf overlaps in a given point, you simply need to select that point on the dashboard, and you will see, for example, in this case, that 20 groups have turfs that intersect in the center of Worcester, where that was selected. So you see then here scrolling through what one could find out about the groups that intersect within that particular point. Now, if you wanted to compare that, for example, using our questions, what's going on in Pawtucket? Again, you would just select within Pawtucket or a particular area of interest to you. And in this case, you'd find that there are 37 groups whose turf overlaps in that area. And you can, again, do that same kind of scrolling through and identify different groups and look at their specific attributes. And then, for example, if you wanted to go a little farther and investigate how funding networks differ between these two areas, and again, just using these the interactive dashboard and network visualizations, you could search for organizations in the drop-down menu on the left and see, for example, the reported funding network by the Blackstone River Coalition as compared to, for example, the Blackstone River Watershed / Friends of the Blackstone Group. Similarly, if you wanted to learn about who groups go to for knowledge or expertise in these different regions. You could select the Blackstone River Coalition again as an example. I'm really stuck on them for some reason. And then alternatively, one could look at the Blackstone Valley Tourism Council to see how their knowledge networks differ. So you could search this again on that sort of individual group basis, comparing different areas. So all that's to say that there are different questions that you can bring to bear to the dashboard, to the interactive network diagrams, and also to the data layers. And so we're really interested now in sort of opening up a dialogue, and we'd ask that you enter in the Q&A any kinds of questions that you'd like to ask to the data, or other kinds of things that you're thinking about in relation to the data and information that we've collected thus far. So I'll just step back, and Leah and Pang and Avery, if you all can monitor the chat to see if any folks have questions.
Sure, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A already, but please continue to respond in the Q&A with the question that is currently on the presentation. So this first question is for Kurt. Kurt, how would you rate public involvement today compared to public input the time of when you were in the mix?
Well, I guess it sort of makes an opportunity for me to remake my point, was that if you look at the time period of 87 or so through today, you see this expansion, multiple expansion of stewardship work, the diversity of it, the scale of it, the funding sources for it, the networks that support it. And so I would say in that period of time, it was just an explosive period of growth and entrepreneurial thinking and innovative thinking about what stewardship is and what it can do. And I think what we see with this project is it's captured that. And if we're all concerned about where this goes and the point of climate change, with this project, you can start to strategically analyze what I think is the driving force of conservation and protection of these coastal resources, and frankly, climate adaptation. So starting where I began, which was really a simple idea, where we're going to pass laws and make governments do stuff, to 15 years later, no, we're going to go raise money and do stuff ourselves. We're still going to pass laws and make governments do stuff, and we're also going to try to educate communities and build networks and do all these other things. That's the difference, and I think this project gives us all an insight how to understand it and strategically engage with it in a way that perhaps can increase capacity and capability in the context of what we're facing over the next, decades ahead, let's say through the 21st century.
Great, thanks, Kurt. Another question is, does the data include the types of stewardship?
Yeah, so we get at that in a number of different ways in the survey and in that attribute data. We ask groups to select, amongst those 12 different functions, so they can select all the kinds of stewardship that they engage in, and then also, again, force them into saying one. But we also provide some open-ended opportunities, so describing their mission, for example, and again, the sort of site types and also organizational focus get at the sort of different ways that groups are identifying in terms of engaging in work. And so there are different ways that someone could sort of ask that question of what is stewardship, what kinds of activities are stewardship activities are folks working on. And so, for example, in past, we didn't ask explicitly about groups that are working on racial justice or environmental justice, for example, social justice. But there are some groups who named that in their mission statements or named it in some other of our open-ended questions. And so there are ways that one could ask what are groups up to in even a broader frame of social issues. But again, that would be comprehensive. There's just a sort of like opportunities again to sort of ask the data what's potential to what can one potentially learn about the region from this data set.
Great.
Jesse or others, do folks have any other thing that you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it was pretty comprehensive, yeah, I mean, I think let's just continue to hear what some of the questions are. Make sure we get to them.
Great. So the next question is, do you have plans to maintain this database? And if not, how would it be kept updated and sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, so well, go ahead, Jesse. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, sure. I think, I mean, that is something that is on our minds frequently, and I think the short answer is we don't have an immediate plan. We have, and that's partly subject to funding. But internally, we've discussed a lot about how we continue to make sure that this stays current. If there are groups that were unable to participate, because this survey was done during the height of the COVID pandemic when many groups didn't have capacity. So how can we get those updated? Look at change over time. And so we have a lot of ideas, and we've been talking about them. And so just know that it is something that we care about and are doing. But it is something that we care about and are trying to think how it can be done. But we don't currently have an actual solid plan for doing it. Though I would like to mention that there are some other StewMAP. There's another StewMAP going on in Massachusetts, and we did partner with them to ensure some overlap in the region that overlaps between our StewMAP and theirs. They did theirs about a year after we did ours. They're just wrapping up right now. And so we did collaborate with them to ensure that we could at least try and get some time series data for that section of southern Massachusetts that overlaps. But yeah, I mean, it is a really good question, and it's something that that is on our mind in every one of our weekly team calls almost. And so, yeah, if you have other ideas, please let us know. Bryce, is
if I can add a quick thought here, we hope the New England grant makers and other organizations, funders networks, see this as valuable because they've been supporting organizations, NGOs that are in our network. We're in this database for years. So we need to somehow we need to make that connection because this, for them, this could be very strategic because they've really been an investor. I mean, I can tell you who invested in Save the Bay. I can tell you who's been investing in a lot of these groups, and hopefully they see an interest in seeing this data maintained and there's some value in it. That doesn't mean to fund it, but we're going to have to look for that kind of thing, and we're going to need people to help.
Yeah, I think just to ensure that we're, I guess, being comprehensive to the person in responding to the question. One other interpretation of the question that I had was, where will this be hosted and held? So just that the U.S. Forest Service, the Northern Research Station, is facilitating our group to host the dashboard on the USDA Forest Service ArcGIS platform. So the information will stay there. It'll be interactive there. And so that will also be accessible through the SNEP network, and in our reports and things that we can produce will also be shared through the SNEP network. So there are a couple different ways that folks can get at the information where that'll be hosted beyond just this group of us that are working on the project. And that community of practice that we mentioned, the StewMAP community of practice, is working on some efforts to make these to make a sort of live version of this, but that's still very much in development, and it's not something that we've tested here locally. So we can't speak to its ability to sort of function well within this region, but certainly it's something that folks are trying to advance.
Yeah, we've just sharing ideas. I mean, one of the things that we've also talked about within our own little amongst the five of us is also just sort of thinking about other ways of other ways that StewMAP could function is, you know, citizen science-y type things, or something where, you know, people were able to maybe even update on their own, you know, provide updates to their information, or nominate someone to participate. And so again, these are kind of exciting ideas that we have. And like anything, it's just finding the time and the support to continue to develop them.
Great. So the next question is there a way to filter the data for, is there a way to filter the data, for example, to identify those entities who identified as managing stormwater in a given watershed or region?
So this version of the dashboard doesn't filter in that way. So currently, if someone wanted to look at that, they could download the attribute data file when that's hosted on the SNEP network website, and then they could search that way. So you could sort of, you could work with the CSV file in that way. So this current version, the way that one would identify that is if you had a geographic region that you wanted to look at, you would just have to scroll through and look at the attributes and look at the organizational foci or the site type, and you can identify that and mark that. But currently, this dashboard, just given there are different limitations and opportunities with each of these ArcGIS platforms, and one of the limitations of this kind of dashboard, of this kind of platform, is that it doesn't allow for that additional layer of functionality. So yeah, that was one choice that we made to search, to be able to search this way. But there are other ways to do this, not within the current project fold, but yeah, the easiest way to do that would be to download the data and search, or to look across the dashboard.
Great. So the next question is, could you include a more direct way what types of stewardship organizations are working on?
Can you say the question again?
Sure. What types of organizations, or sorry, what types of stewardship are organizations working on?
Basically the request is to have a more direct view of these of the stewardship activities.
I think so. Yep, to include a more direct way to access that information.
Yeah, I mean, that's great feedback, and definitely the types of things we want to hear, because if that's a key variable that's resonating with you guys out there in the audience. We don't see anybody. It's always strange. Thank you for that feedback, and I think we can discuss internally about what we can do to make that happen. As Bryce mentioned a moment ago, there's always some functionality trade-offs, and so we chose to really favor the geospatial map interface and query, which does have some limitations for some of these other ones, but at that one I think we should be able to do.
Great. And the final question is, and I think you already answered this, but can the data be open sourced? And I believe you had mentioned that it will be available on the SNEP network website. Were there any other ways that folks can access this website? I mean, sorry, data?
Yeah, the US Forest Service site.
Well,
or contact us. Yeah, and actually to that point, I mean, I think this is actually a really good point to make too, and maybe near the end here. So first of all, as we've implied, there are some organizations that chose not to be in the public facing data, and so when we write reports and talk about that, we're actually often talking about a larger sample. I mean, it's not a huge difference, there. And the other thing is that, even in the case of the network data, I mentioned that we've made publicly available the aggregated data. We've posted that on the website, and to avoid confusion, we haven't posted the disaggregated data, because I think it gets confusing when you put out into the public all of these different data sets and people start, trying to understand what one means. And as I said, it can be a little bit hard to properly interpret the disaggregated data. But if there's anything that anyone was interested in either learning more about, whether it's working with some specific slice of the data, or if they have some specific questions like, hey, this issue or topic is really important to me in my region, and I'd love to just know more about what the data can tell me or to help me understand something. You know, please reach out to us, and then we can figure out, like, you know, to what extent we could support that type of inquiry. You know, that's actually, we wrote that. That's actually written on the website. This is not something I just came up with on the moment. This is from the beginning. That was a goal of ours. So yeah, the data is available on the Forest Service website and through the dashboard and on the SNEP website. But if there is any other query that someone was interested in, just reach out to us, and we can see what we can do. Just be supportive.
Great, and we'll be sure to post your contact information on the webpage itself, so when folks go to the webpage, they can, you know, quickly access your email. This presentation is also going to be available on the SNEP Network website. So there are different ways where you can access the team's contact information and content specifically about, you know, things you want or things you want to hear or questions you may have. So Bryce, I see you have one more conclusion, and I'll hand it off to you to sort of close us off.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and sort of awkwardly now just offering a conclusion, but yeah, just sort of coming back around to say, you know, we think of this as, you know, we know that there's a heavy emphasis on the natural environment and measuring, and of course that's important and valuable and necessary, but there's often less a focus on the people doing the work and what that structure is like. So going back to some of Kurt's comments and of course comments by Jesse and Lynn as well. So we see this as a systematic analysis, you know, a particular set of folks that responded to our efforts to try to understand it, would provide us an opportunity to understand environmental organizations in the Southeast New England region, measuring these sort of groups of people who are doing this work. And so again, folks are you know, in this conversation, folks are thinking about how they might use this data. And so we're glad that you are, and we're hopeful that folks will continue to sort of, yeah, as Jesse said, reach out to us and think about opportunities for diving into this data. And then we also just want to be intentional about the ways in which we talk about and think about how this work contributes to, for example, broader discussions around environmental justice work within the environmental protection community or environmental community. And you know, in many ways, we think that our data can help with environmental justice, quote unquote, inquiries. So we think that someone could ask, for example, who works where and with what mission or interests, who are central and peripheral orgs in the network, and where might we build partnerships. So we think that there's an opportunity to ask questions to the data and sort of think about opportunities, but this is not an analysis of environmental justice groups. So we didn't set out explicitly to sample and hear back from groups that are working explicitly on environmental justice issues or in communities that are affected by environmental justice, communities of environmental justice concern. And so we think that's an important thing to recognize. And yet we also know that there are questions you could ask to this data that would give you a sense of how some things are working. But again, it's not comprehensive, and that wasn't explicitly what this project set out to do. So we think it's important to sort of to name that, and also think that there's you know, to sort of think with everyone about opportunities to work with this. And then we're also working with the SNEP Network Environmental Justice Advisory Group to sort of think about how one might work with this data and work more intentionally around those topics. So again, just sort of name that there are resources. So we'll have this dashboard, which needs to still go through a USDA Forest Service review. So that will take a few weeks before that's going to be publicly available. There will be a report that is builds off of this webinar, and that reiterates a lot of the things that we talked about today. And then there's a data download, so the publicly available data layers that will again be hosted on the SNEP Network website, available for folks. So yeah, we just would end by saying thank you and ask that you'd be in touch if you have specific interests or questions. My contact information is on the screen along with Jesse's, and yeah, information about the funding for this project is below. So thank you all for joining us in this webinar, and I'll hold for any questions that folks have for the next minute or so.
I'll just say thank you, Bryce, for speaking for the bulk of this talk. So thank you.
I see folks are jumping off. So yeah, thanks to you, Jesse, for talking.
Good job, boys. Good job, everyone.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Casey. And thanks, Avery, Pang, and Leah.
Thanks for the help.
Thank
Thanks,
you, everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.